Here, my dear listeners and viewers, let me tell you about the history of Arabic Egypt from the very beginning. Beginning with the initial Arab conquest of Byzantine Eastern Roman Egypt from 639 to 642 AD under Amr bin al-ʿＡṣ, who was the commander of the forces fighting for the Rashidun Caliphate in Egypt. Under him were battle-hardened veteran troops that had just fought in Iraq, Syria and the Levant, not to mention in the conflicts before that on the Arabic Peninsula. Against them stood an exhausted Eastern Roman Empire that barely had troops left after their defeats in the Levant, and the troops they had would most likely be inexperienced new recruits that were badly supplied, as they had to be supplied by the sea, as the land routes were cut off, and Egypt itself was at this time a devastated area that had been ravaged not due to the recent conflict against the invading army of battle-hardened Arabs, but in various previous raids into the area due to several decades of conflicts between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire, who had fought, ravaged and taken over Egypt at various times. Hence, the area was pretty war-weary. But Egypt was still a province under the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled by a governor with the name of Cyrus and or al-Muqawqis as in the Arabic sources, who was residing in Alexandria, the provincial capital city of Egypt during this time. Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ's invasion probably started with initial raids and trying to find local allies in 639 and before, as this invasion probably had been prepared for years in advance, considering how quickly and successful it was. Following the Babylon fortress siege of 640, they quickly took over most of Egypt and laid siege to the provincial capital city of Alexandria in 641, where they made an agreement with Cyrus or al-Muqawqis, whatever name you prefer to give him. And it is said that al-Muqawqis made an agreement with Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ for the Byzantines when they were surrounded in Alexandria. Yaḥyā ibn Khalid al-Adawi informed us on the authority of al-Layth ibn Sa'ad that Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ, when he conquered Alexandria, surrounded and harassed its people for 3 months until they grew fearful of him. Al-Muqawqis asked him for peace and made a treaty with him for the Copts on the condition that he would wait for the opinion of the king. Here in Ibn Abd al-Hakam's work, it is stated that the siege of Alexandria took 3 months, but other sources say it took 9 months. But in al-Balādhurī's work, it states that it took 3 months for the second siege in 645, after the Byzantines had retaken Alexandria, more than 3 years later after this siege. So there are some conflicting sources about the length of this siege and possible mix-ups between this siege and a later siege of Alexandria that happened a couple of years later, after the Romans returned to try to retake Egypt. Anyway, regardless of this confusion and mix-up of potential sieges, the Treaty of Surrender in this initial siege was honored, as none was killed or taken captive as slaves in the conquest of Alexandria, though the city was still sacked and plundered. A further issue with Ibn Abd al-Hakam's account here is that al-Muqawqis or Cyrus is speaking on behalf of the Copts rather than just the Roman interests in the area, as the local Egyptians and the Roman central power were two very different things, and indeed there existed a lot of conflicts between them and a lot of disagreements, especially between the religious Copts belonging to the Coptic Church rather than the Eastern Roman Byzantine Church, which was the Roman state church. And the Roman state often persecuted a lot of the Coptic believers in Egypt. And thus, consequently, Copts here in this source ought to be interpreted, rather than specifically Coptic Christians, as Egyptians generally, as the Coptic Christians were kind of enemies with the Roman centralized government. And connected to this is actually a rather interesting fact about the Coptic Christians' rule in the Arab Islamic invasions of Egypt. And several of the Arab sources mention the Copts' pivotal role in the Arabic Islamic invasions of Egypt, including Ibn Abd al-Hakam, Yaḥyā ibn Ayyub, and Khalid ibn Humayd said that God opened the way for conquest for the Muslims, allowing them to kill many, and they followed them until they reached Alexandria, where the Byzantines were fortified. There were strong protected fortresses, and the Muslims occupied the land between Hulwa and Qasr Fars to what lay beyond that, and with them were the leaders of the Copts, who provided them with what they needed by way of food and fodder. The Coptic leaders and many under them actually helped in the Arab invasion of Egypt, which made it possible for the conquering Arab armies to bring Egypt under them and to secure their control over the area. After which they imposed the jizyah poll tax as part of the surrender of Alexandria and the rest of Egypt, at the rate of 2 dinars per family head, per male adult head of a family. Amr bin al-ʿAṣ crossed the Egyptian frontier and after taking several Coptic villages besieged Alexandria. In the meantime, al-Muqawqis, finding it absolutely futile to resist the powerful Muslim army, negotiated an agreement of peace with Amr bin al-ʿAṣ, according to which the Copts were to pay a jizyah of 2 dinars per adult male, plus a contribution of food and clothing. Not a small sum per year, but also not impossibly high either, as the normal family income ought to have been about 10 to 40 dinars each year, depending upon multiple factors, with the male family heads probably having several earners under them, such as children working for them, as well as maybe the women of the family also working, and a normal wage being just under 10 dinars per person per year. Though wages could be very different for very different professions, and I'm mostly basing this upon the wages of farmers and most mid-level skilled professions. And I'm also basing it on the rates of normal wages and production taxes in later Abbasid and Mamluk times, both in Egypt and elsewhere. And considering that these are a couple of centuries after this invasion of Egypt, they might not be entirely applicable to Egypt during this age, but it was the closest I could find and do a comparison with, in order to get a generalized sense about how much of a tax this was, probably. And even in the worst case scenario of just 10 dinars here, the jizyah tax, which was actually most of the taxes, was only 20%. And it often didn't need to be taken in direct money. Often it could be paid off with other sorts of services or in products, for example grain, equivalent to that sum in dinars, or a contribution of food and clothing generally. Al-Tabari also indicates that tribute was already paid before to the Romans and Persians who had controlled Egypt before the Arabs took it over, and that the current sort of jizyah tribute might have been a lesser burden than those tributes previously, due to, among other facts, the previous overlords being more hateful to be under. Tabari might be biased here, but incentives to actually have high taxes and of not wanting to pay taxes to these previous overlords would follow from the general patterns of persecutions that had happened earlier in Egyptian history with regards to the Copts. Also, John of Nico, a Coptic bishop and near contemporary, actually does claim that the taxes were higher during the reign of the Roman governor of Menas over Alexandria than they were later under the Arabs regarding the city of Alexandria. Amr deposed Menas and appointed John in his stead. Now this Menas had increased the taxes of the city, which Amr had fixed at 22,000 gold dinars, and the sum which the apostate Menas got together was 32,057 gold dinars. He appointed for the Muslim. Though it ought to be mentioned, and I will mention this further into this video, that John of Nico describes a lot of taxation abuse and of raising of high taxes by the Arabs later in his work, later in the takeover and occupation of Egypt. But it is still important to recognize that he also describes the Romans as having been very abusive in their taxation, in their governance of Alexandria. This described high taxation of the locals, as well as why the locals would aid the Arabs in their invasion of Egypt, have their origins in a lot of previous history between the Roman governance and the local peoples of Egypt. And this history includes a lot of religious elements too, which are not easily summarized, but I will try. And I will give a bit of context. In 451 AD, following the Council of Chalcedon, the Church of Alexandria was divided into two branches. The Melkites, who followed Roman church doctrine of Diophysitism, and the Miaphysite Copts, and the majority of the Egyptians belonged to the Miaphysite Coptic interpretation of Christianity, which was deemed heretical according to official Roman state church doctrine, and thus this led to brutal Roman persecutions of the Coptic believers, with killings and brutal military crackdowns and periods of Coptic profession and Coptic practices being banned, as belonging to the Coptic church was forbidden by official Roman state doctrine. Though in practice the Copts remained, despite these persecutions and repressions coming from the Roman centralized state. And Cyrus, the Roman governor, had exiled the Coptic patriarch Benjamin, and open Coptic worship had been forbidden after the Romans' retaking of the province of Egypt from the Persians in 629 AD. And speaking about the Persians, Egypt had been conquered and occupied for a decade by the Sassanid Empire in 618 to 629, and the Sassanid Persian Empire followed a type of Zoroastrianism that was pretty intolerant towards other beliefs, and issues with persecutions of Christians is documented to have happened at several times in the Persian Empire elsewhere. So it is not a stretch to imagine that the Persians also persecuted the Copts and the non-Coptic Christians too in Egypt, especially considering how Christians had been persecuted after the Persian conquests of the Levant through very brutal means. Both the Romans and the Persians had histories of persecutions and brutal repressions of those that differed from their state religion, and the Copts of Egypt had suffered under both, with the ultimatum of convert or face often deadly persecution. In comparison, the Muslims offered a third alternative, to pay jizyah, which might have been a lower tax, and they would in exchange be mostly left alone. Islam as a state religion was not as intolerant as these two other state religions of Eastern Roman Christianity and Sassanid Zoroastrianism, in that it actually allowed you to keep your religion without major persecutions if you paid a special tax. So it was a lot more flexible in that regard too. And furthermore, the invading Arabs actually provided a strong army that could see to it that the lands of Egypt actually were not invaded again and that order was kept in the land, as this had not been the case during the preceding Roman-Persian wars, where the province of Egypt had been the battleground for various conflicts between the Persian and the Roman empires, with following lawlessness and general chaos being the result of these back and forth conflicts between the Romans and the Persians. The Arab invaders would, in contrast, offer a period of peace and stability to a people that had probably become very war-weary due to these conflicts before. And this led to aid by local Coptic groups and people that allied with the Arab invaders, because they were seen as the lesser evil in comparison to what the Romans and Persians had been as rulers, and what their rule had entailed for the lands of Egypt and her people. And everyone said this expulsion of the Romans and victory of the Muslim is due to the wickedness of the Emperor Heraclius and his persecution of the Orthodox through the Patriarch Cyrus. This was the cause of the ruin of the Romans and the subjugation of Egypt by the Muslim. Though it should be stated that despite the support that existed for the Arabs that were invading Egypt, the conquest did not always occur smoothly. Egypt was taken both by treaty, with allies opening the gates and surrendering to the invading Arabs, but also by force at times. Though mostly the major cities of Egypt were conquered by treaty, certain villages on the countryside had to be subdued by force and put to the sword and or enslaved. And this could be pretty brutal, as stated by John of Nicu, and the yoke they laid on the Egyptians was heavier than the yoke which had been laid on Israel by Pharaoh, regarding forced labor by the Arab invaders. And when the Muslim learned that Dominatius had fled, they marched joyously and seized the city of Fayoum and Abut, and they shed much blood there. Furthermore, he also noted the brutal sacking of Nicaeus and the city of Sauna. And thereupon the Muslim made their entry into Nicaeus and took possession, and finding no soldiers to offer resistance, they proceeded to put to the sword all whom they found in the streets and in the churches, men, women and infants. And they showed mercy to none, and after they had captured this city, they marched against other localities and sacked them, and put all they found to the sword. And they came also to the city of Sauna, and there they found Escutavas and his people in a vineyard, and the Muslims seized them and put them to the sword. Now these were of the family of the general Theodore. Let us now cease, for it is impossible to recount the iniquities perpetrated by the Muslim after the capture of the island of Nicaeus on Sunday, the 18th day of the month Genboot. These are rather brutal examples of how brutal the invasion of Egypt could be, but it is important here to keep in mind that this is pre-modern time, and brutality in war was generally more the rule than the exception. Furthermore, these atrocities that are mentioned by John of Nicu might have been limited to certain areas, especially when you consider that it seems to have been the case that people joined with the Arabs and supported them in certain places too. And it has also to be kept in mind that we are dealing with pre-modern armies that are hard to control always what they do in pre-modern times before modern communication and modern systems of command and control. Even modern armies are hard to keep in control at times from committing atrocities. Never mind armies in the past, when you had even less ability to control them. Thus, these atrocities that we see described by John of Nicu could be an example of isolated incidents or isolated cases committed by local forces here and there. Still, we do not see any indication in any of the sources, neither Arabic Islamic sources nor in non-Muslim sources, about there being systematic campaigns of persecution and mass killings, as you can see in the case with both the Sassanids and the Romans in their previous wars. So it should be kept in mind that the Arab invasion was, in certain regards, brutal towards Egypt, but it was not bad in comparison to other armies and invasions of that time, such as the campaigns made by the Persians and Romans. And speaking about the Romans, in 645, the new Eastern Roman Emperor Constans II tried to retake Egypt and ordered a large fleet to carry troops to Alexandria to make a landing and take over Egypt. These soldiers managed to take the city in 645. The Romans thus temporarily conquered Alexandria and retook it back, but the army was quickly defeated in the field of battle, and Alexandria was retaken by the Arab forces again, in a siege that only took 3 months, and that I suspect that Ibn Abd al-Hakam confused with the previous siege of Alexandria. In any case, the Arabs, aided by local support, managed to conquer Egypt from the Eastern Roman Empire and keep it. And this is a tale about how persecution and overtaxation can make people turn against you when the opportunity arises. How internal oppression can lead to you losing the grip of power when an external enemy appears and people join them against you. A story about abuse leading to betrayal. Speaking about betrayal and abuse, and especially taxation abuse, as I mentioned taxes before, Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ was appointed the governor of the province of Egypt following his conquest of the area. And one of the first things he did once he was appointed as governor was to abuse the taxation system and begin to heavily tax people in Egypt, despite having promised to not do so with the people of Egypt, raising more taxes than just the 2 dinars in the jizyah. And Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ's greed is described by John of Nico with descriptions such as: he was a lover of money, he doubled the taxes on the peasants, and he threatened death to any Copt who concealed treasure, and he had no mercy on the Egyptians, and did not observe the covenant they had made with him, for he was of a barbaric race. It became so bad that the Caliph Uthman had to step in, and he recalled Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ. Later sources about this are contradictory. Some indicate continued extreme taxation abuse, and that Uthman recalled Ibn al-ʿAṣ due to him not bringing enough taxes into the caliphal coffers. Though some of these sources I do doubt due to confusing later Umayyad caliphs with Rashidun caliphs, so it seems that they do not have a pretty firm grasp about what really happened. Other sources speak about Uthman having acquiesced to popular demands of removing Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ from his position as governor of Egypt, and granted tax relief to the peoples of Egypt, as well as a certain level of independence that ensured their loyalty to his rule and the rule of his closest allies in Egypt. The fact that Uthman managed to stabilize the situation in Egypt, and that taking these sorts of actions would conform to the general pattern of flexible rulership vis-a-vis local issues and local peoples that the Rashidun caliphs often practiced, and that Uthman in particular practiced, makes me more inclined towards this later interpretation of Uthman having acquiesced to local demands in removing Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ due to his bad governorship and overtaxation of people. You also have to take into consideration that keeping Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ there and continuing an unpopular taxation policy would risk Arabic Islamic rule in an important province that still, despite earlier devastation, Egypt still was. Because Egypt was still a very rich land in terms of farmland and other resources, and needed to be kept under control and kept stable, and thus revolts and potential rebellions had to be avoided, and thus policies that could cause these things and cause instability in the region needed to be avoided, especially with consideration that the Arabs were a tiny minority in comparison to the large local populations of native Egyptians that lived in Egypt. And you were under pressure from foreign enemies trying to reconquer Egypt, such as the Romans, who the local population could easily join with when they tried. Furthermore, you do not want a giant rebellion, especially when you are in the middle of consolidating all of the conquests in the rest of the Middle East and North Africa that have recently happened and are happening. Speaking about consolidating power, during the first fitna, the first Islamic Arabic civil war, Muawiyah, the first to be Umayyad Caliph, would send back Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ to conquer Egypt in 658 from the supporters of those that opposed him and supported Ali ibn Abi Talib. But that is another future story that I might go into more detail about in the future. Interestingly enough, it seems that Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ seems to have had local support this time too, either due to local converts supporting him or due to his time as governor actually not having been that hated by all sections of Egypt. It is possible that as a governor he only applied his disliked taxation policy on certain sections of Egyptian society or on certain regions of Egyptian society, and thus his policies were limited to only parts of Egypt, whereas other parts still liked him and were loyal to him. Furthermore, it is possible that since Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ was fighting under the banner of Muawiyah, who was connected to the family of Uthman and a supporter of the cause of the family of Uthman following Uthman's assassination, Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ managed to get a lot of the legacy of loyalty that existed towards Uthman, who was probably well liked by a lot of Egyptians. If he had previously listened to their complaints and acquiesced towards them, giving them tax relief and greater independence. Furthermore, like Uthman, Muawiyah had had a policy of ensuring local support through local goodwill in many regions by being flexible and allowing a lot of local management and not being too interfering in local matters or too imposing by one's will upon the local peoples. And thus a lot of Egyptians might have felt more secure in supporting Muawiyah's cause than the cause of Ali for other reasons. In any case, Amr ibn al-ʿAṣ managed to conquer Egypt once again and became its local ruler through an agreement with the newly ascended and first Umayyad Caliph, Muawiyah, whose banner he had fought under, and he would remain as the local ruler of Egypt until his death, though this reign would not be nearly as problematic as his first period as a governor, implying that he might have used a different style of rulership in this second period that was a lot less heavy-handed and did not cause issues of unrest due to heavy taxation. A style you could probably describe as being more flexible towards local needs. And his reign would last from 658 to 664, ensuring that Egypt would be firmly under Umayyad Caliphal control, and thus ensuring continued Arab rule over Egypt. And with that ends the last lines in the chapter of the Arab conquest of Egypt. A complex chapter, with a lot of factors to consider, and with many that I have not mentioned here. But an interesting story about how Egypt came under Arab control, and about how oppression can cause disloyalty and a loss of control, and about the importance in maintaining and ensuring the loyalty of local peoples through flexible rulership in order to maintain control. And I hope that you, my viewers, have found this video interesting. Please leave comments, ask questions, and push the like button.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.